Historic Fells Point, Baltimore. His new book, Freedom Seekers, Early Abolitionists in Antebellum, Baltimore, includes a chapter on Frederick Douglass. And without further ado, welcome Mr. Newfields.
All right now. Good morning. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Ms. Diane and Ms. Gina, for arranging for our talk today. Unfortunately, it's a tough task. To talk about Frederick Douglass in 10 minutes is just nearly quite impossible. So what we're going to do is try to squeeze it in and leave some time for question and answers. For the most part today, my talk will center on Douglass's first book, The Narrative of an American Slave, written by himself. And for this morning, first I'll just say I've been doing the Frederick Douglass Walking Tour in Fells Point for 21 years. And we've had hundreds and thousands of different people coming from all over the world into Baltimore to do tourism. In some type of way, they find my little tour. And so over the 21 years, we've had a chance to read and listen to a lot of Frederick Douglass's words and read his writings. And what I thought today would be a good theme would be to talk about Home Sweet Home, which with Douglass, we're going to look at the first 18 years of his life. And while we talk about Douglass's first 18 years, you look at what your home life was like from your earliest infant years until your childhood years, getting to elementary school and middle school and high school. The things that happened in your home during those 18 years are perhaps the most crucial learning experiences that you have. So my theme today is Home Sweet Home. And so we'll start by looking at Douglass's first 8 years at home on the Edward Lloyd plantation in the area of St. Michael's and Eastern Maryland. During those 8 years, Douglass writes about the hard scenes that as a child in his childhood home that he saw. And we know that things that happen in your home, particularly in your first 8 years, help create the person you will sooner or later become. Now, what Douglass saw, unfortunately, and he writes about this, he said his home was not filled with love and caring and nurturing and protection and things that fall under the umbrella of childhood education. Douglass writes he had none of those. His childhood home was filled with horror, dread, violence against men, women, and children, solely based on the color of their skin, which dictated the status of their life as a slave. Douglass goes on to write that he was sometimes almost starved to death. He talks about having no bed to sleep in, no shoes, no trousers, no shirt, no loving care. He never can write about, as a child, going to school, having education in a classroom setting, and then returning home. He never writes about being able to live with his mother, who he only saw 4 or 5 times in his entire life. He didn't know as a child who his father was. But what he did know was the hard scenes that he saw daily when enslaved persons were whipped, beaten, mutilated, just about every human right that you as a child had in your household for the first 18 years. Douglass had none of those things. What he had was a life of servitude, bondage, and severe whippings. And he had that in his first 18 years of life. Where is the love and Home Sweet Home for a Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, who, as we know, becomes Frederick Douglass? And so when you read his narrative, he gives explicit details on some of the hard scenes, severe whippings that he saw happen to women, particularly women who were of the master's favor, who would not bow down and do exactly what their master said at all times. So Douglass' Home Sweet Home really was the exact opposite. And he states that after he left the Eastern Shore plantation and comes to Baltimore, for 12 years, from 1826 to 1838, he lived in Baltimore. And in Baltimore, he too saw cruelty of slavery. He saw human beings being treated worse than animals. He himself was attacked on the Fells Point dock by 4 young men, white young men, and beat almost to an inch of his life. His left eye was almost knocked out of his socket. He was beaten so bad, in fact, his master went to the justice of the peace to file liability claims against the perpetrators, saying that they had damaged his property. In Baltimore, this was his home sweet home. In Baltimore, he was beginning to learn how to read and write through the mistress, Sophia Auld. The husband found that out, stopped it, and admonished the wife never to teach a slave to read, saying that he would be unfit for anything, particularly this one here, referring to their little Freddie. So Frederick Douglass' first 2 decades of life, there was no such thing as a home sweet home. Never had a bed to sleep in. In fact, he had to sleep in a cornmeal bag. That was his sleeping bag. And he had to sleep on the floor most of his life. Well, the story, thank God, does not end there. On September 3rd, which is 8 days ago, 1838, Frederick Douglass decided to claim his own freedom, to run away from his home, sweet home. Now think about that. A child comes up in his house. Home is his most special place. But in Douglass, he saw fit that he needed to escape from his home to find freedom in the North. And in 1838, for the first time in his life, Frederick Douglass had a true home with his bride, Miss Anna Murrah Douglass, and their 5 children. Now, when we look back over those first 18 years of Douglass' life, you would think he would be very, very bitter, as we see in the case of innocent men who have been released from prison because the DNA now has proven them to be innocent. You would think those persons who served decades in prison unjustly would come out and be very bitter. But they're not. Most of the men who do that and get their freedom, they're so happy to be free. They do not hold the anger and the bitterness of what had happened in Douglas' case, 2 decades of his life. So his home sweet home doesn't get sweet until he takes his own freedom and moves to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And from there, his life takes on an unbelievable course to become a true inspirational life story for those who are willing to read his books, read his writings, and see that although he started life as a slave, he ended life as a United States Marshal. He started life as someone else's property. He ended life as a property owner. And his legacy, after he passed on February 20th, 1895, today is just quite unbelievable. Frederick Douglass is the only man in Maryland, and perhaps in the entire country, but I know in Maryland, he's the only man that has 5 statues. Think about that. 18 years of life without a real home, no bed to sleep in. But today, he has 5 statues in Maryland. In addition, he has 3 very well done museums in the state of Maryland in his honor. So September 3rd every year is a very special week right before the Labor Day holiday celebration. For those of us who are Douglassites, we always remember September 3rd as his day of freedom. And so this year, in his home county of Talbot County, Maryland, and in Easton, they unveiled a $50,000 mural for a man who was once a slave. The very next day or so, they opened the largest capital project in Washington, D.C.'s history. And this was a $442 million Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge. And so I think the metaphor and the storyline is, I think there's a lot to the students on my tours. It's not where you start from. It's how you go on your journey and how you prepare yourself for your journey. And on 9/11, God bless those who died on 9/11 and the families who were affected by it. But on this past Saturday, 9/11, I had a tour bus of 38 young students, Black African-American male, age 6 to age 16. And for the theme of the tour, I used freedom plus education equals success. And so I asked the young folks, how do you describe your freedom? What do you think would give you the best route to having freedom in America today as a young African-American male? Which, of course, can be a very dangerous person to be because, unfortunately, America has not always embraced young African-American men. So what I told them, I said, if you want more freedom, you must get more education. If you want more freedom, you have to apply yourself and learn as much as God puts in front of you. Similar to Frederick Douglass. When Frederick Douglass realized that his master would not have him have the ability to learn to read or write, that became Douglass' all-out quest. Even before he had a quest for freedom and abolition, as an abolitionist, he wanted to learn the English language and to be able to write the English language and to speak the English language. So I think the inspirational story behind Frederick Douglass' life is he started life as a slave. I don't know if there's any worse position you can start life as a 1 day old baby coming into this world. And to overcome those obstacles, never been to school a day in his life, never lived in a house with his mom and dad, seen people sold and whipped, but yet there was a quest for knowledge inside of Frederick Douglass, which, as we know today, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman are two of the most referenced names in American history. Not so much of the status in which they were born in, but how they used their life and how we look at their legacy to overcome oppression and prejudice and bigotry. So today, that's what we ask all of our corporations like the Gilchrist to do. And having a diversity and diversity and inclusion and equity committee shows that Gilchrist has seen there is things that we as a country, we must do better at. We must be more inclusive. We must prepare our students for greater opportunities so everybody can feel and experience what we know as the American dream. And so I think Douglas' story, along with Harriet Tubman, are two of the most inspirational stories, I think, in American history. We're now at 11 minutes, so I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. What a powerful testimony. And, you don't get better than Frederick Douglass, right? Frederick Douglass, even after escaping slavery and coming into the abolition movement, as you know, had to contend with forces even there who, I think early on, they didn't want him to speak at rallies. And he was able to overcome even that adversity. So you said that young people, you shared that education is the way to set them free. Where do you get, you spoke about Frederick Douglass and his powerful resilience, right? Where do you think a young person can kind of draw on that resilience today?
Well, I believe that our young people must be directed to proper attitudes when they're entering the school building, in the school classroom. And beyond that, I think students need to have that reinforced by going to libraries. Like the Enoch Pratt Library, the Enoch Pratt Free Library has an African-American department in the main headquarters downtown. And on the entrance to that building is one of Frederick Douglass's most famous quotes. It reads, "Once a man learns to read, he shall be forever free." And I think talking to students, they must realize, regardless of the obstacles they face, even in a city, public education school system like Baltimore City, which is having so much turmoil daily in the news right now, the student still must, on today, Monday, September 13th, he still must get up and go to school and put forth his best effort, even though he and his family for weeks